time, I fell in love with the role of the executive pastor because I watched when it worked right, it would completely change the posture of the senior pastor. And I've never had a craving to be a senior pastor. My life has always been to want to see the church thrive, the senior pastor thrive. And I began to see in multiple scenarios when that person's in the right seat, when it's the right executive pastor pairing with the senior pastor, it can actually settle the whole church and position it for all kinds of amazing stuff in the community.
Welcome to the Shepherds Podcast, a podcast by pastors for pastors, designed to be a communal space where relationships and resources bring refreshing and renewal to those who shepherd and lead congregations. Connect with us and check out more episodes and resources at theshepherdsnetwork.com.
Welcome back to the Shepherds Network Podcast. It is great to have you with us. I'm John Carter, your host, and today we're going to talk about one of the most important things we can learn as shepherds and leaders of the local church, which is to find the things that are weighing us down and find the people that we need to help us carry and lift those responsibilities. And we're going to talk specifically about the role of a particular kind of pastor that's arisen in the last 20 years that comes alongside the senior pastor to help them do what God's called them to do. And that's the role of the executive pastor. And to help me talk about that, I have one of the great executive pastors that I've known in my lifetime, Chris Folwell. Chris, it is great to have you with us. And thanks for coming back and talking with our pastors and shepherds and ministry leaders about this very important role of the executive functions of ministry.
Well, Pastor, thank you for having me.
Talk a little bit about your history with the executive side of ministry.
Yeah, so I began working at a church in Rochester that was a couple hundred people, and we experienced a lot of explosive growth. With that came all of the excitement, and then came all of the hiring everybody that was sort of like the low-hanging fruit, who can we hire quickly, that faithful volunteer, let's keep this growth going. And then that slowly over time, the excitement is still there because you can see the life transformation, you can see the spiritual fruit. But then then the crisis begins, like the Monday through Friday, of the sustainability of, how are we going to manage the administration? How do we transition 45 new guests per weekend into a meaningful experience? How do we get these people into classes? How do we not just become a weekend church? How do we avoid those threats? How do we not lose who we are? And as that began, I was not in the executive pastor role, but I remember the moment we hired someone who came from a secular job, who had a father who was a pastor, always felt like he had a call to ministry. And then I began to watch that individual just start to clean house with grace and with energy and it didn't take anything out of him. You could tell he was in a sweet spot. And then shortly after that, I was invited onto that team to become an executive pastor, and that would begin a several-long journey of learning from that person. We did studies where we would visit churches in the United States that were very successful at having executive teams. We would get on site, we would spend time with them, and it was my responsibility to organize those trips and to meet those people. And over the course of that time, I fell in love with the role of the executive pastor because I watched when it worked right, it would completely change the posture of the senior pastor. And I've never had a craving to be a senior pastor. My life has always been to want to see the church thrive, the senior pastor thrive. And I began to see in multiple scenarios when that person's in the right seat, when it's the right executive pastor pairing with the senior pastor, it can actually settle the whole church and position it for all kinds of amazing stuff in the community. So that's when, there were some really difficult times during those years too of figuring it out, some very difficult times, but it was through those years that I absolutely fell in love with the role. Still love it very much.
So I want to talk a little bit about the history because I came up in the Bible college system when pastors went to Bible college and were formally trained for ministry. And we were trained mostly in Bible theology and the hard skills of ministry, pastoral visitation, caring for people, some organizational stuff, but not heavy leadership or strategy stuff at all. And our primary text was Scripture. So there wasn't a lot of dialogue with the secular best practices.
Right.
And this was in the early 80s. And then the megachurch movement began, and churches began to really explode. And traditionally, when you got a church of about 300 people, you started looking for, this was kind of the rule, an assistant pastor.
100%.
Or an associate pastor,
Yes.
which would mean they'd be next to you, but they would handle a lot of the administrative and management of the church. The average church had a staff of maybe 4 or 5 people, right? And as churches began to grow, 300, 500, the need for larger teams, employed teams became important, large groups of volunteer leaders. And so pastors began to get weighed down. And I did some study on this. It was back in the 80s that an acolyte of Peter Drucker, who was a great leadership guru, he basically had a guy that came up under him named Bob Buford. And Bob was a devout Christian, and he began to see these larger churches of 500 to 1,000, maybe 1,500 people struggling. And so he called some of these pastors together, and it was no agenda. They just said, and he was in Colorado Springs, he just said, hey, let's talk about what the challenges are.
Wow.
And as they began to talk about it, they recognized that what they needed was not just a good second pastor, but somebody who was highly skilled and trained in executive, administrative, strategic functions.
Wow.
And so the role of the executive pastor was literally given birth to by Bob Buford and that group of people. And it began to take root in the 90s and really strongly in the 2000s and in the last 20 years. So for some of us, the executive pastor may seem a little foreign to us. We think more in terms of an associate or assistant pastor, and that's still an important role. And yet when you get to a certain scalable size, you need to have somebody that handles the executive function. So talk to me a little bit about what your feeling is as it relates to the importance of that executive role and what the title should be. And at what point do you start looking for someone to fill that role?
Well, over the course of my year, especially in the last 5 years, I find myself at a minimum once a quarter at an event, primarily due to my relationship with Pastor Wayne Francis, who has been on the Shepherds Network, with pastors that are leading large churches. So Wayne and I host events. We go on these fishing trips. We do different things. On those trips, what I have found is you meet a lot of very happy pastors that are leading large churches of over 500, over 1,000, what it might be. But as you settle into these environments and you're around the fire, you're out to dinner, and I'm a very, sometimes to my disadvantage, I'm so aware of how people are feeling all of the time. When I'm in those spaces, I'll begin to notice people that I sense are incredibly unhappy. And when these guys start getting comfortable, they realize that they're in a place that they can trust other people. They can sense that all the guys around the room carry a lot of weight, with employees and things like that. They start to open up. And you just find so many lead pastors that are incredibly unhappy. And when I'm sitting with those individuals, the ones that are very happy, the ones that are unhappy, a lot of times you can tie it back to the ones that are happy. They made a very strategic decision at the right point to change the organizational structure of the church to remain committed to their leadership style. And they had great counsel. It could have been something...
Explain that, their leadership style. Just dive into that a little more.
I think the best way I can describe it is by telling a story, and then I'll kind of work my way back. I was with a group of these pastors celebrating the 20th anniversary of a church in Texas with a super close friend in a church that I've been working with down in Texas for 3 years. And we were all out afterwards, several of the pastors that had flown into town to celebrate. And one of the guys spoke up and asked me what I did. And I began to explain the work that I do to help the lead pastor. And it just kind of came out of me. I said, something that I've noticed is that at some point in a lead pastor's journey, the ones that are unhappy, they make a choice where they kind of fall on the sword for the sake of the church. So other people feel certain hires should be made. Other people's voice becomes very loud in the church around, well, if this church is going to run great into the future. And slowly what that senior pastor does is they begin to surrender the way God has wired them as a shepherd. Now their church could go on to continue to be incredibly efficient and grow, but you find a person in their office dying.
They feel trapped.
They don't love the team that they lead. They may love them as people, but they don't love leading that team because that team is no longer a fit for them. Other situations where I've seen there be joy, for example, there was a gentleman I was sitting next to on a fishing trip, and I knew that he led the largest church of all the pastors who were on this trip, and he was the most at peace. And I picked up on it. And one morning at breakfast, I sat next to him, and he's become one of my closest friends. I said, "Why are you like this?" Because all these other guys are so anxious.
Stressed.
And to hide their anxiety, all they talk about is their church, and it's awful. Because we know they're not actually talking about their church because they're excited. They're just anxious and they don't know what else to talk about. Why are you like this? Because I know, and I'm just talking to him as a friend, I know you have the largest church here. And the first thing that came out of his mind was my executive team. I know my executive pastor and my team is back home. I know what they're doing and I know they're good. And if they're not good, I know they're going to reach out to me. And I've known him now for multiple years. I've seen him in his home. I sleep at his home when I'm in Texas. And it's true. So I've seen the difference, and I don't even know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are. This is fantastic.
I've seen the difference of when the executive pastor in that structure works to complement the strengths and the weaknesses of the senior pastor. And I've seen when a church goes on to grow and flourish, but he forsakes owning the right that this team should fit my style. Regardless of how many years people have told me, well, my style doesn't, church has gotten so big, you still hold the right to build the team that complements your style for the sake of that local expression of the body of Christ. And I've known many pastors with large churches that gave that up. And when you get to the core of their heart, regardless of what they say and how they act in the groups, they're not happy anymore.
Right. Because it's not the way they're designed. Talk a little bit about the different styles of senior pastors, because you're suggesting that you need to have a team that fits your style. What are some of the different styles that you've seen that lead pastors have?
So I feel like for me, because my brain just goes to situations with lead pastors, so an example that I'll give is there's a local church in Rochester, New York, where the pastor had talked with me for many years about churches growing astronomically. Any pastor would crave the growth that they're seeing financially and with people. But when we're sitting on my front porch, talking, hanging out, it's a different story, the struggle and the weight, and he's still doing all the weddings. I mean, people wouldn't believe it if they really understood how big the church is and how much he was still doing. So my family and I, we began getting very close to that church and close to that pastor, and I said, because this is the church we love here locally, it's where we're going to attend, I want to volunteer and do this work for you. I don't want to contract with you and your church. So we sat on my back deck, and I took him through this whole process, and the process was to discover his style. So this particular lead pastor is not the kind of person that wants to work with an executive team of 4 or 5, even though his church could afford that. What he wants is he wants 2 individuals that basically breaks up all the ministries of the church into 50-50, and we came up with those categories and everything that would work and the job descriptions associated with that. His style, he's not a highly relational guy. He's not the kind of guy that is very charismatic when he walks into a room, but he's one of the most brilliant teachers that I know. That's his gifting, and God has gifted him with the intuition to lead his church.
Right.
So we designed for him a style that was 2 executives, 2 very well-paid executives, even though he could have had, again, 3 or 5. I know other senior pastors that love to sit at a table with 4 to 5 individuals, and they love the chemistry and the joy and the community and the vibe of that room. It's fun for them, and they may not be paid as much as the church with the 2 that can harness all those resources, and there's other advantages and disadvantages to both of those when it comes to pay and that kind of stuff. But those are the 2 primary styles that I know, though I do know a church in California, and this is why I think it's so tailored to the lead pastor. Again, it's a very, very large church, and it's the senior pastor, but a very unique fit of one executive pastor that runs the whole staff. And it works beautifully. And I know a lot of senior pastors that would be afraid to do that because of relationship and trauma. They say, I can never do that,
Or maybe they tried it and didn't work.
But in this setting,
yeah,
it's not just working, it is flourishing. When I say flourishing, I could tell you story after story of what's happening from their youth ministry to their discipleship to the staff. It is flourishing. So that's why I always say I love hearing the stories and I love reading about what's working at some of the large churches, but my passion for what I've seen is you have to have the skill to be able to sit with the lead shepherd and get to their heart and how God's wired them and be strategic enough to build it from there.
Yeah. So what are some of the responsibilities that the executive pastor or an executive type pastor carries in a growing church?
To me, it all comes down to what is burdening the lead shepherd. And this is funny because there's a church, I'm always hesitant to mention places, but we'll say way upstate New York, where the pastor would tell me like, man, I need an executive pastor so bad. I need an executive pastor. And I would push back on him and say, you actually don't, because you love the business side of the church. Like, stop pretending like you don't love it. You love it. You know, when I talk to you, you never look tired. You know, it's not that. You need a brilliant associate pastor. You need someone besides your assistant that can actually assist you just with whatever you need, because he's younger, he has the energy, and if he gets a really skilled executive pastor, they'll hate each other because they're both going to be super dominant. They're both going to want to do.
Yeah, right.
And
they'll be competing.
Yes, I've seen it.
Wow.
Because they've been to the churches that have the executive pastors, and now they can afford one or whatever it looks like, so they get one, and they're both miserable. So my encouragement to him was, if you want me to help you, I can help you find a brilliant associate pastor, but I don't think I've convinced him yet, but I'm still...
You're working on it, yeah.
But what I would say, if I was, talking with the lead pastor, I would say, what currently burdens you the most about leading this church? The parts that feel most ill-fitting to you. Most of the time, it will come down to the HR. So much around HR. That they've known for 5 years an employee has to be let go, but they're devastated by it. So now we're going into year 6, 7, or 8.
And you're a pastor too.
You're a pastor.
So it's not like you're just running a business. These are the people you're leading, they're your sheep. We're naturally given to grace and opportunity and growth. We want to see people grow.
But as a pastor, you can also see that the stewardship of God's resources is borderline being abused, because you're giving money to people that aren't doing their job good anymore. You can see that people that have been in jobs forever need to transition to other parts of the church, but you don't know how to you don't have the energy to do it.
Right, that's very true.
I've seen that a ton.
Because there's an emotional burden to making those transitions. And I know as a pastor, when I've recognized I need to make a transition, I'm also calculating, okay, and I'm pretty good intuitively of thinking how I can see the dominoes, right?
Yes.
So this person leaves, and then there's going to be all the people around them that are going to want to know why, right? And sometimes telling them why is helpful. Sometimes telling them why is not. You can't.
Right.
Right? And so, and then they've got to metabolize the shift.
Yes.
Right? And then the congregation has to metabolize the shift emotionally.
The layers.
And so and then there's an adjustment period. And so I know that when I've had really important and necessary staff members who've departed or left, and even in the will of God, sometimes they left without having a Timothy, an obvious step in.
Oh, yeah.
And when that's the case, you have to, I just know in my mind, okay, so they're going to be leaving in 6 months. So that means I've got to find somebody for this, I've got to find somebody for this. I've already got a full plate. And now I've got to communicate to this group and this group and this group. And then there's going to be an emotional period where people are adjusting. There's going to be questions coming in. Why did they go? What's the real reason? There's a whole world of what happens when you make these shifts that the person departing isn't really,
right.
They're not thinking about it. They're thinking about what's next, right? But you have to manage that on top of what you're already doing.
And that's just one example of what an executive pastor can take.
So let me just say that. So what I have done at times is I've avoided.
Yes, that's exactly what happens.
Because it's overwhelming to me.
And it takes a pastor who's tired, and it's just another thing that's making them more and more tired.
That's it.
But imagine, which this is what I see, imagine if you have an executive pastor that loves that stuff. and says, Pastor, who are the 3 to 5 people that you know either need a transition or what's burdening you? Let's do an assessment of the staff. And they love the Lord, so they're going to go away and pray. It's not just the executive function.
Right. It's not just a hard, secular,
so they come back because they're an executive pastor.
Right.
So they come back to you and say, well, Pastor, with this person, I really feel like the 3 of us should meet. I'm going to send you the agenda in advance. Here's what I think. This person just needs to be fired. Like, I can tell they're belligerent. I've gathered feedback from the staff. I can own that. CFO will connect, but with your permission, we're just going to let them go. But imagine, and this is what I see happen, they can, within 2 months, they bring this sense of peace because they're gifted to see it and to feel it. So I'd say HR is one of those that I've seen be very popular. A lot of times I've met pastors that are feeling very burdened by, right now, children's and youth ministry, particularly youth ministry. So they want someone that can come in and not just assure safety, but assure like pastoral care amongst families. Curriculum, we've lost a lot of passion for deeply theological curriculum.
Right? Totally.
So how will they partner with the children's ministry? Do we purchase it? Do we write it? How do we employ a youth pastor who is a pastor but also can grow something past 35 people? Seriously, so I've seen that. They'll hire an executive pastor just to repair, restore, and build like the family-oriented ministries of the church. So that's always my question when I'm meeting with a lead pastor. The big question is for me to get a sense through conversation. But what I always do, not wanting to talk too much about this, I always ask the senior pastor first, tell me about when Jesus first told you that you were going to lead a church. Because a lot of times, even the people leading big churches, it's unbelievable to see the emotion and the spiritual moment. Like, I'll share with them. Tell me about what Jesus said to you about regional impact. Tell me about what Jesus said to you about the vision of the church. So it's almost like trusting the Lord to supernaturally restore that in their heart just for a minute. Like, Jesus, give us clarity as you're burdened and overloaded and haven't been on a date night in 6 months or whatever's going on with this. That's an extreme example. From there, I eventually take them to a...
But it's not uncommon, Chris.
No. I'm
playing
it down a little bit.
And I'm not just pastors of churches of 1,000 or more, pastors of churches of 150 people.
So through that part of the process, the goal, let's restore like a little bit of confidence right here, and then I'll kind of flip the page real quick to say, all right, let's talk about your staff. And then what it does is it takes this dream that had to come from the Lord, takes this dream that trust came from the Lord, has been affirmed hopefully by the elders of that church, and now we're going to partner it with the current reality. From that current reality, we're going to figure out what's burdening you, what's hurting. In my mind, and I'm not just saying this like I've designed it, this is from talking with friends who are doing it well at their churches, talking with senior pastors who have done this process well. When it's built and it's discussed around the person that the Lord and the family that the Lord has called to lead that church, that's where I've seen those relationships be the most sustainable and last the longest.
Wow.
And that's the difficulty of, I'm all about like Vanderbloom and Slingshot and these different organizations.
And just explain what those are, because there may be some that aren't familiar with it.
So I have worked with and I have no issue with like large, powerful church hiring organizations.
So Vanderbloom is an organization that basically helps churches find staff.
Yeah, and I hope I'm saying their name right. I'm pretty sure that's it. But what I always say to lead pastors, what I've also seen with those organizations, that don't bank on them to lean into the unique personality, leadership traits of you. So make sure you're prepared to describe to these big, powerful organizations exactly what you need. And a lot of times what you get is lead pastors that are so overwhelmed and tired, they're just like, find me an executive pastor. Find me one. And if they don't own really figuring out exactly what they need to deliver to these hiring organizations, they will get 100 referrals and end up just hiring the one that's like the best of the 100. And I've known many churches where that hasn't worked out. So for pastors just listening to this podcast, I would say, you've got to get together with, whether it's an elder, whether it's an associate, whether it's with a pastor friend that knows your heart well. Before you would partner with an organization like that, you've got to get with somebody that knows the untired you, who loves the church.
The untired
yes.
you.
Yes.
Talk about that. There's a difference between you exhausted and you when you're like present.
Well, as we were talking about before the podcast recording today, one of the common mistakes that I see in selecting an executive pastor, it's like going grocery shopping when you're hungry. You know what I mean?
Yep.
You end up spending $500 and you get all this food home and you're like, oh my gosh, whatever. They're desperate. So you're not making a decision. It's like my one buddy that would always tell me when I was in like a point of leadership crisis, he would say, Chris, before you do anything else, you need to elevate. You need to ask the Lord to help you mount up with wings like eagles. Like you're at a 500-foot view, you need Jesus to help you get to a 50,000-foot view. And my friend was a very skilled business person, so he helped me learn how to do that practically.
Okay.
Don't make a decision until you get above this situation. And what I see with lead pastors is they make the choice around the type of executive pastor they need when they're exhausted. So they're not making the choice. It's like a rescue choice.
Right.
So you end up hiring somebody that's really good at fixing stuff for like 3 to 5 months.
Right.
But they're not somebody who's going to partner with you for the next decade of building this church.
Right. So they come in, they're project people, they get it done, and they're bored and they want to move on.
So that's why I tied it back to if you're going to select somebody, if you're going to hire an organization to help you find an executive pastor, you have to find a way to get clarity before you reach out to them. They're so used to people calling them at the end of their rope. Get with people that can help you kind of recover the vision of the church and what you really need. Then contact those places to help you find the right person.
So I have a story. I'm not going to mention the organization. It's one of the larger Christian headhunter organizations that we talked about. And there's a church that I'm familiar with that in their heyday, they had a couple thousand people in the church. The senior pastor transitioned and went through some different things. And the church had shrunk. And they were down to a few hundred people. And they really needed, a senior pastor. So they hired one of these organizations who went out and did what they do. And they used metrics and statistics and asked questions. And they came up with some candidates. And there was one young person that came forth. And so they hired this guy. And he was a very much energetic, very passionate young guy who jumped into it and got the church growing. I think they grew several hundred people in just a few months. But he was hired into a system that had a team of elders, and those elders still had the reins of the church. And this young guy wanted control of everything, and he just hadn't had cooked character. Consequently, when it got tough, it overwhelmed him, and he literally left. He just left and never came back.
Yeah.
And so the church was devastated, and I'm not trying to criticize the young man, but clearly he had not been trained.
Yes.
He had not been vetted in ministry, because when you're trained in ministry, you know that you're making commitment to God's sheep.
Yes.
And it may be difficult for you, but you have to stick it out. And there's a way to enter and there's a way to leave. So I think that that's the one story I know of somebody using a large organization, and it wasn't a positive end result. Now, I'm sure there's lots of good stories, but...
Yeah, well, I think one of the ways I can tie this back to the role of an executive pastor, there's a leadership team of a church that I sit on in Rochester that I've now sat on that team for 5 years. When I say this to people, they don't even believe it. I actually took a picture of the document to show one of my executive pastor friends to prove to them. They do succession planning with their staff in like a 5-year plan for the regular staff. So when we're around the table as a leadership team, people are thinking far in advance of who will succeed them if they retire. I was in a meeting where someone 7 years in advance was already talking about, for the sake of the kingdom, talking about who am I thinking and praying about when I'm done with this role. I think a lot of times why lead pastors end up with an organization like that is because if you have a great executive pastor, that person is going to be thinking about succession planning.
Strategy.
Yes. In that same church that I'm on the leadership team up in Rochester, they do this with their volunteer leaders too. Because
That's so key.
Yes, there was an Excel document that goes through the different people, and if somebody goes on vacation, it's so easy because the associate director of the ministry steps in and runs it. There's never, and I say it to people, and they're like, "Oh yeah, it's probably like that on paper. It's probably what they say." I'm like, no. This church actually does it, like they do it. But what they have at the table is they had a woman who was wildly successful in business, retired, and at no cost offered to be the executive pastor of the church, which this is something I tell churches that can't afford a great executive pastor. As I said, well, have you prayed and asked the Lord for one? Because more than once I've said, well, let's just write the job description, because if you need one, and Jesus knows what you need to lead a local thriving congregation, what if there's somebody in your congregation right now that's doing so well in business, they're ridiculously under-challenged, and they're deeply yielded to Jesus, and they love you,
Right.
and they can come into this office for 20 hours a week and change your life. I've seen it happen. So, might be a little bit off track, but going back to what you were saying, another great thing that an executive pastor will do is they'll have the elevation to say, all right, let's start thinking about succession planning. I'm not saying that's what that church might need, but just going back to your comment, sometimes I think we end up with those hiring organizations because you don't have somebody like an executive pastor that's thinking, hey, lately when I'm doing my one-on-ones with the youth pastor, I can tell that he's probably on a 3-year track before he plants a church. So an overwhelmed pastor might know that in his heart, but might not be thinking in the one-on-one, hey, I know you want to plant a church, so I'm just going to tell you in a couple of years, we're actually going to hire an associate youth pastor because we want to, and I know a church in Rochester that had an associate youth pastor, their youth ministry was thriving, the youth pastor left and it didn't skip a beat because this person stepped right in.
Because there was somebody to step in. That's so key.
But if you don't have a great executive pastor that's having these one-on-ones, that's coming to you with that information.
That you can trust.
Yeah. That's a good fit. All of these crises just live in the mind of the lead shepherd. They know the youth pastor is going to plant a church in 3 years, but there's no capacity to be like, hey, let's hire an associate youth pastor. That's not what they're thinking about. They're thinking about the building campaign. They're thinking about their own marriage, a spouse they're going to that's unhappy.
Preaching schedule.
Preaching, whatever it might be. These are all the gaps that a great fit executive pastor can do if you have a lead shepherd that's secure enough to work with a great executive pastor. Because I've seen that mistake too, where they want someone that can help lead, but the moment they see that person really start to walk in authority, get the job done, they start to pull that person's authority back just a little bit. They start wanting to be part of meetings. They start wanting
Because what happens is the people that they're leading come to the senior pastor and they're saying, they'll tell him stories or her stories about how their perception of that. And so sometimes the pastor is trying to smooth the waters and will then buffer that. So this is, I want to say this. This is one of the greatest challenges I have, personally. So you can counsel me right now, all right? I'm all about discipleship, right? Train others who will train others also. I think I've been really successful over the years finding faithful people who are able to do the ministry. But I think where we haven't fully gotten it is sometimes those faithful people haven't been training others to do their job. So when they depart, there's not somebody to step in.
Yep.
The other side of it is when you delegate something, and as a pastor, you're going to give this to somebody, right? At the same time, the person you're giving it to is a human being, and they're going to have strengths and they may have weaknesses. So how do you get information? I've had experiences where I've put somebody in roles and I've just delegated it and then later found out that there were key things that person was failing on. Maybe they weren't meeting deadlines. Maybe they were behind on things. They were frustrating the teams that were working for them, but the teams that were working for them were told, don't go to the pastor. right? So the dysfunction continues. The pastor is blind to it because all he's seeing is the downside. He's seeing the person, and the person's giving reports from his perspective or her perspective, but sometimes they're not even hearing the truth of how their leadership may be negatively impacting or their weaknesses. So how does a pastor, do you put somebody in a role, delegate to them, but at the same time, make sure that there's checks and balances, so if their leadership is straining or failing or there's a weakness, you can become aware of it in a way that doesn't undermine them?
Wow. Well, there's so many different answers to that. Let's start with at the executive team level.
Okay.
I would say if the executive team is strong and healthy, you have to pick the best person on that team to answer that question. Because there's somebody on the team that will know how to provide those checks and balances. Because if I was on your executive team and you asked me to fix that, I wouldn't sleep for 3 nights. That would be so exciting. Because that's what I love. I would say, oh, wow, okay. Well, let's take a quick look at how we do quarterly reviews. Let's take a quick look at how your staff is really doing their one-on-ones with people. Are the people who should be getting weekly one-on-ones getting them? Or are they getting monthly one-on-ones?
Right.
Let's take a look at, let's sit down with head of HR. Have they felt permission to really investigate, design, and redesign systems that free you up from having to worry about that? So if there's an executive team in place, the question would be, even if the team has growing to do, is there somebody on that team that God has innately gifted to be very passionate to fix that problem? So that would be my first thing. If you don't have an executive team, I would say you have to find somebody in your congregation that works in an environment with checks and balances. Because as the church that I was working at was growing, there were times where I'm thinking of a few people, many of which I've told you about, Pastor, that were very successful in healthy corporate life. Not like unbalanced, drive you to burnout, but worked for like great organizations. They would hear about some of the tension that I was dealing with at church with an irate staff member or that kind of thing. And they would look at me and say, how long has that been going on with that person where they just don't respond or don't do those things? And I'd say, I don't know, it's 6 years. It'd be some ridiculous amount of time. And they would say, wow, like in my environment, like we would care for them, but they would have been fired 4 years ago. So tell me about the culture at the church that's allowed that behavior for so long.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And they were very kind people who loved Jesus. And
Right.
And I would say, well, I think that we're just emphasized so much of what we consider to be pastoral that we have forgotten that there's resources involved here, and we could actually be robbing God of the opportunity to replace this, and to be serving the families in this department of the church better. And we've just forgotten how to have those hard conversations. Like, if I need to have a hard conversation with you about your marriage, I can do it any day. Or if it's very pastoral, but if I need to tell you stop coming in late, or if I need to tell you if you send me that report one more time, I'm gonna write you up, like that kind of language. So, again, the executive team, the right fit. And I would also say, and I've done this many times, finding other churches, and I could list a few churches right now, one in particular, which you and I have talked about, 12 Stone Church in Atlanta. Since 2009, there's been someone on their leadership team that I've had on speed dial. And when I met the senior pastor of that church, and I just got a sense of how they were ran, I called the church the next day and I said, who here can be a voice of counsel to me? Finding other churches that do this well, they a lot of times know other churches don't do it well. And a lot of times you find they're not trying to sell you something. The churches that are actually really good at it, they're not trying to sell you something. This is an opinion. The churches that are always trying to pitch like their leadership kind of thing, like join this is going to sound really cynical, but you kind of get under the surface and you're like, wow.
It's a business.
It's a business.
Yeah.
But I take 12 Stone, for example. Since 2009, it's just been phone call, text message. We went down there, we spent time with their executive team, and they just served us, took time out of their schedule. Because
it's a calling.
They know they're good at it. They know other churches aren't good at it. All their resources are free online. You can look at every church member's job description. So a lot of times I tell pastors, I'll just say, hey, let me take your hand, and in a real simple way, let me connect it with this guy, Chris Huff down at 12 Stone, who's just loved me since 2009 when I've been desperate in need of a leadership question. Pastors, I think, sometimes forget that there's people like that out there.
Or don't know that they're out there.
That don't know that they're out there.
So I think this is fantastic. This conversation is so important. And I know that there's pastors that are connecting with this right now. One of the things, and I'm just going to, again, lean into my own vulnerabilities here. One of the things that I have internally struggled with is I am a teacher, I am a pastor, and have a pastoral heart for people, and I have a prophetic calling.
Yeah.
Those three are very different roles. And I'm comfortable in all three roles, but what's required to do those are different. And sometimes when I'm leading people in the church, we have multiple layers of relationship. I'm their pastor, their sheep. That's the first relationship. I'm called to be their shepherd. Then secondarily, they're putting on an employee hat. So now I'm the employer, they're the employee. And what I find conflicting is sometimes in order to be a good employer and hold them accountable, it somewhat compromises my capacity to minister to them as a shepherd.
Yes.
Because I may have to not harm them, but hurt them as an employer. But they're going to need comfort from their shepherd. And it's difficult. It's not so difficult for me to switch hats, but it's harder for the people to switch hats. So when they go from the sheep to the employee, they're seeing you as pastor, now they're seeing you as boss, and it becomes complicated. So sometimes what they do is they want to perform well as an employee, but they hide their weaknesses that the shepherd's role is there to care for. So what ends up happening is as a shepherd, you know what I'm saying?
You're describing it so well.
And then I'm aware of that. So I've got to address something in the employment side, but then immediately my pastor's heart kicks in and goes, I want to minister to them.
Yep.
But it's not ideal to be the person that's doing both.
Yeah.
And so this is where having good executive people under you that can manage some of the employment side of it is so important, so you can stay in that pastoral role.
Yeah, and it was at 12 Stone that they would teach this language, which I know, again, something that you and I have talked about. And it sounds so simple, but a lot of times, so for someone like yourself that's led this church for 35 years?
In January, 35 years.
So you've learned how to change those hats. But what I have found, and this, like if I was...
But it's not easy.
I know, it's not easy. But if I was working with let's say if I was doing a staff training, and I've seen this done, 12 Stone taught this to us, and then we did it, I would say, hey, we're going to introduce something staff-wide in meetings where we describe the changing of hats in a meeting. We're going to educate the staff what this means, and it can even become kind of fun. But what we're doing when we do that is we are equipping the executive team and the lead pastor to do this efficiently. And we're going to do a whole training around this, and here's what can happen in any given meeting. And a lot of times what we would train is to leave everything pastoral for the end of the meeting.
Okay.
So the example that I can use is I was working with, one of my favorite opportunities that I had when I was an executive pastor was working with a unbelievably gifted, I'd say at the time, 25 to 27-year-old artist. When I tell you the work that this person would produce was mind-blowing. Like you could take it and you could put it up against anything being produced in the global church, which could sound like I'm exaggerating.
No, I hear you.
And this person was connected to other artists that loved Jesus. So there was actually a whole part of the office that we just dedicated to that team because they began drawing other young people to that team. And I had a short season of ministry where I felt like the Lord allowed me to lead this person. It was short. But leading that gifted of an artist who had some really strong qualities, but some other things that needed to be developed executively, this changing hat language became very important. Because at the beginning of the meeting, the hat might go on to say, all right, I'm just going to put on my supervisor hat for a minute. I've noticed these certain things going on. I know we created an intake system for deliverables when it comes to graphics and things. I'm receiving feedback from multiple staff that we're not replying to them when we're going to be late on a graphic design project or a video. So I'm thankful we invested in the intake system, but we have to talk right now about how are we going to fix this communicating back to staff when things aren't going to be on time. Supervisor. But then an opportunity would come up where they would have this amazing intern opportunity in another country or something really unique to grow their professional skills. And I would say, all right, I just feel in my heart, and I'm just being honest, this is how we say, I'm going to put my mentor hat on right now. I'm going to do everything I can possibly do to make sure you can go on that trip. Because what I can see the Lord doing in you, professionally and everything, if it takes you 2 months, you have to go. Because for the sake of what He's going to do through your life in the future, we're going to figure it out. And then there would be times where something very spiritual would be on my heart, like praying for this person, and it'd be like, okay, I know this is going to feel a little odd because we talked through work and we talked through some leave and vacation time, but is it okay if I put my pastoral hat on for a second? Because,
Yeah, and that's so important because when you say what hat you're going to wear, it cues them to think in the right box.
And a lot of times when I put the pastoral hat on, I'd even say, depending on how intense it was, I'd say, hey, I want you to know I connected with Pastor on this first. Not every time, but sometimes. And I just want to tell you, I was praying for you. And I just had this concern for you, whatever might come next. And if at a staff level, people begin to recognize those hats, you can do a fun training with different hats and things. It positions you. You can say, hey, I know in staff meeting a month ago, so-and-so talked through the different hats that you wear. And it kind of prepares the table for you. And say, I know I'm your pastor, but I got to put my managerial hat on. If you're late again, I've spoken with HR and, this is business kind of thing.
And this is what's going to happen.
You've grown past that. That cannot be anymore. So I'm going to send an email. I'm going to copy you and want you to be aware. And in this season of your ministry, I hope you're not having to have conversations like that. There'll probably be more with the executive team, which I know is not happening. But whether pastor be you or someone else on your team, that training, again, this is what a good executive pastor does. Does training staff-wide that positions everybody to win.
That's fantastic. Chris, this has been amazing. I want to ask you one last question, and we just have a couple of minutes. What are some things that the pastors and the shepherds who are watching this right now, what are some things that they can do if they realize I don't have the team I need, or I've got to make some serious shifts because I'm like that person you described. I'm feeling miserable, or I feel like I'm trapped, or I feel like I've acquiesced my true pastoral style to accommodate what my team is demanding. What are some practical things that pastor can do immediately to start a process of getting that team healthy and finding that executive function that can come alongside?
I feel like that question could be answered at different size of church.
Absolutely.
But if I were to say just what I sense in my heart.
Let's say a church of 300.
300. I would say first thing is the shame around the feeling of failure, of not being able to do it as well as it needs to be done. I have seen that drive many pastors to just make poor moral decisions, have things going on. That feeling alone can cause someone to quit over time or make a really poor decision. So the first thing I would say is take that feeling of failure and just ask the Lord to help you to separate that. Ask Him to give you the grace to separate that and just to feel, that even right now as watching this podcast, to feel free from it for a minute. The next question would be to ask Jesus, you've given me all that I need. I trust that you have. So who have you already positioned in my life that can give me wisdom? And there could be a very gifted business person in your church, even if they don't lead a huge business, but you have seen them grow something. You see that they have the mind to figure it out. Ask them to have lunch, especially thinking of a church of 300, and say, hey, I know you have 7 staff that work for you. I know that you love Jesus. how are you running your business? Even if it's nothing like a church, how are you doing it and wanting to wake up every day? Because if I don't strengthen my managerial side of my leadership a little bit, I don't know what I'm going to do. I would say that would be step one,
Okay.
just to get your breath back.
Yeah.
Once when you get that, I would then say find, and if they're watching and they connect with you, Pastor, connect through Shepherds Network to one of us, let us, the Shepherds Network, help you find churches that are generous with their hospitality when it comes to helping pastors get on their feet. Let us within the Shepherds Network connect you with a church within the network that can have lunch with you, can have a Zoom with you, and just counsel you about, here's your current structure. If you just make these few moves, the next couple months will be better. If we can plan financially to make these moves over the next 12 months, then things are going to get really good. And to actually believe that things can get really good. Not saying easy, but things can get so much better.
Yeah. That's fantastic. I think, so let's give them some information. Those of you that are watching, the Shepherds Network is just a coalition. It's a community of pastors and ministry leaders who are doing the best to lead the flock, the local church. And we want to provide, first of all, we want to provide resources so that you have access to information that will help you to become better as a leader. We also want to provide for you good teaching that's going to help you to really learn how to become more efficient and effective. We want to provide community, relationship, and connection. And we want to provide sources of restoration and refreshing for those that are working in the local church. That's our vision. It's real simple. But if you'd like to be a part of the Shepherds Network, you can go to theshepherdsnetwork.com and just, sign up. There's no cost. It's just you become a part. And there's the podcast. We do one-days. In 2025, we're going to be doing a number of one-day conferences. That'll be both physical and digital. So you'll be able to connect. And again, if you just need somebody to help you, guide you, we've got a group of leaders that are all pastors that will be available to just talk to you and hear what's going on in your church and maybe help you find the next step. And so you can just reach out to us at theshepherdsnetwork.com. There's also connections, and there'll be information on your screen and in the show notes that will help you to know how to connect. We're here to just come alongside and support you in the work that God's called you to do as a pastor of a local church. So we love you. And Chris, would you pray us out today? Thank you.
Lord, we thank you for those that have heard our voices in this conversation. And we pray, Lord, first that they would experience your comfort right now, that they'd stop doubting their call and the feeling to give up. And Lord, I've sat with pastors that even thinking of taking their lives, the embarrassment, the shame. So we just agree together right now that they would have a moment of peace, that you would be a shield around them.
Yes,
and Lord, we pray in that moment of clarity, they would sense you giving them courage to take the next step, to reach out. God, I pray that even at the end of this podcast, that they'd go to the Shepherds Network website and just reach out. Take some kind of step so that they feel that they're moving forward, not that they're stuck. Lord, we thank you for this. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Chris, this has been great. Thank you so much. And thank you for being a part of the Shepherds Network podcast. We are just so excited about what God is doing and what God is going to do in your church and in your life and in your ministry. Until we talk to you again, may the Lord abundantly bless you in everything you do for him.
Thanks for joining us on the Shepherds Podcast. For more episodes and resources, you can check out our YouTube page or our website at theshepherdsnetwork.com.